Hello, my name is Ryuhei Hosoya. I'm professor at GCS, the School of Global and Community Studies at the University of Fukui in Japan. Before coming to Fukui, I was with the Japanese Foreign Service for 40 years. In between those years, I also worked for two international organizations, the OECD and UNESCO. I was also at one time a researcher in international relations theory. This course is a primer on IR, international relations. We will look at IR holistically, across the board, and from different angles and dimensions. We will not look so much into specific countries, regions, or specific topics or issues of the world, picking up what's in the news. That we'll do in another course. In this course, our objective will be to gain a systematic understanding of IR, looking more into the underlying principles, forces, and mechanisms which are at play instead of just the outcomes. We will make reference to specific facts and figures, but only to the extent necessary to make a general point. We'll always focus on the big picture rather than details, although the devil may sometimes lie in the detail. And in doing so, our approach will be more theoretical than descriptive. So what is IR? I would say that IR is like this image here, the image of an elephant. This comes from a parable of India in ancient times, where the king of India had heard about this big creature called the elephant. He wanted to know what it was like. And so he ordered a team of his experts, scholars, to go and find out and report back to him. The thing was, these scholars were all blind. And in this picture, the six of them examined each of them a specific part of the elephant. The scholar who examined the elephant's nose reported back to the king saying it was like a big hose. The one who examined the tusk said it was like a spear. The one who examined the ear said it was like a blanket. The one who looked at the leg said it was like a big column. The one who touched the stomach said it was like a wall. And the one who picked up the tail observed that it was like a snake. And so you can imagine the king was utterly confused. He was not able to gain an overall understanding or image of the elephant. So you can clearly see the moral of this story. As I said, IR, international relations, is really like this elephant. There are as many different images of IR as you get observers of IR. Most, if not all observers, I would say, tend to be like these scholars who examine the elephant. Most teachers of IR will give you a different view about what they see as international relations. But that's exactly why it's so interesting and rewarding to study international relations. After this primer course in IR, you will be free to adopt whatever view you wish to follow and build on to form your own new image of IR. I believe that would be useful for you, whatever future path you plan to pursue, and that path doesn't have to be related to international relations at all. In fact, I recommend IR to students who will go into a purely domestic vocation as much as to students who aspire to an international career. That's because IR is, after all, about a society. It's about the international society, which comprises states and other actors as its members. In its essence, it's like any other society. It may look very different, and there are many actual differences to be sure, but there is nonetheless much in common in terms of the underlying principles and dynamics of a society, whichever society we look into. In a way, those principles play out in pristine form in IR. The essential characteristics of societal relations can be observed in, let's say, glaring fashion in IR because of what nation states are. Their very nature, which is fundamentally self-serving, and we shall be seeing that throughout the course of this class, lends to a study which is as useful to the understanding of societies in general as it is to IR per se. Also, looking into the differences between IR and domestic or intranational relations can again serve to furthering our understanding of both societies. In the international society, there are more than 7 billion people, around 200 states, by one account, more than 7,000 international organizations, countless number of corporations, NGOs, and all other types of non-state actors. What takes place in international relations can therefore be very complex indeed. It's not too difficult to conceive of the elephant as a living being if one is not blind, but I would say most of us are in effect blind when it comes to the international society. It's not at all easy to have a clear grasp of IR in an integrated way. Indeed, the defining feature of IR is that it is very complex and multifaceted. Everyone would have his or her own image of IR, and that may differ a lot even amongst the experts. No two experts will have exactly the same view or image. So how should we conceive of the international society in its totality? I would like to present my own view for what it's worth. If you're from an English-speaking region, I think this sentence will be familiar. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. It's from one of the plays of Shakespeare, one of the comedies, As You Like It. And it's a famous line spoken by one of the characters, J. Keyes. He goes on to talk about the 7 ages of man. And that's what it's all about. He talks about the man or woman playing a role on the stage and that there are 7 acts. And I won't go through it right now. You can easily check up the famous lines of Shakespeare in this play. Again, I think this could be an apt analogy for the international society or international relations. You could either see the whole of the international society as an actor on the scene, or indeed each of the actors, among others, the nation states, as the actor on the stage. So I'd just like to liken the international society to a big stage. Let's just call it the IR stage. Naturally, since this is a stage, there are plays being played on the stage. And for simplicity's sake, I would group them into 3 major plays. First would be the play of international politics. Secondly, the play of the international economy. And thirdly, the play of globalization. You may immediately think, why globalization along with the other 2 plays? Well, this is my own view about it, and I'll be explaining it to you in one of the lectures in the series later on. So let's look at what the main features are of the 3 main plays. This is a simplified chart to show you what the main contrasts are of the 3 plays. So the first play, International Politics, what would be its main protagonist? Well, its main protagonist is the state. And what is its main concern, the state's main concern? It is security. Of course, other concerns, but in the context of politics, security, I would say, is overall the main concern. And what is the main power which comes into play in this concern? It's obviously military power. You might say that military power is the power to coerce. When military power is in play, the game is basically a zero-sum game. And what are some of the guiding principles which govern that concern? Well, these are some of the principles which are often mentioned: hegemony and balance of power. I'm not going to dwell on this right now. And since my university is in Fukui, which is a region in Japan, one of our points of interest is what are the involvement of localities or regions in international politics in this case. I would say the involvement is generally speaking small, if at all. So for the second play, the international economy, who is the main protagonist? Well, obviously states also play a key role, but again, in a very simplified way, I would say corporations are the main protagonist in the international economy. What are their main concern? Profit. What type of power do they exert? Economic power, obviously. It's often said that games in which economic power is played out is a win-win game. And what might be a guiding principle behind the actions of corporations? Interdependence. This would apply as much to relations between states in the economic context. Is the involvement of localities of any significance? Yes, they could be very significant. I would say medium. And then the third play, globalization. Who are the protagonists in globalization? This actually will take a whole lecture to explain, and there will be a lecture at the end of this series on globalization. I will just quickly go through this. The main protagonist is everyone for globalization. Their concern is really everything happening in the world. The power which holds sway in globalization, there are military as well as economic power at play, but I would also highlight the role of soft power. There's a whole discussion about soft power, which has been presented by Professor Joseph Nye, who was formerly the president of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And that's among other scholars who have more or less presented the same concept. Unlike military power, which coerces someone to do what you want to do, and economic power, which buys out somebody to do what you want to do, soft power is neither of those. There are many definitions, but it's the kind of power that makes someone do what you want him or her to do without recourse to either of the other two powers. And we'll come back to this kind of discussion in one of the lectures in the series later on international relations theory. The guiding principle, again, this requires a lot of explanation, which I don't have time to go into right now. I would simply put human nature. And the involvement of localities becomes rather major with globalization. And in fact, from that fact stems an offshoot of globalization, which is localization. Again, I will be referring to these concepts in the last lecture of this series. So coming back to the IR stage, we have the three plays, as mentioned: international politics, the international economy, and globalization. But just having those three plays doesn't complete the picture. So on the stage, these three plays are actually supported by the three props or devices, if you like, in international relations. The first prop is diplomacy. Second is international law. And thirdly, international organizations. Now you can see that just as the three plays overlap a lot, the three props also overlap. The point to note here is that the main player for all three props is the nation state. Very briefly, diplomacy is the prop on which nation states negotiate. International law provides the rules for those negotiations, and international organizations are props which have been formed by a number of nation states in order to work together for a common goal. In fact, all of the three plays and the three props have two important things in common. And the first of those is history. All six of these elements on the stage each have their history. We'll come to history later on. And the other, probably more important thread, if you like, which is woven through all of these elements, is theory. Theory in international relations is meant to capture IR in its totality, shedding light on the principles and the laws that govern the processes in international relations. In fact, a one semester course is hardly enough to cover all of these areas and aspects of IR. In this course, following this introduction, I will give 7 lectures, each representing an approach to IR, and that will have to be at the risk of simplification and omission. Nonetheless, through these 7 approaches, I will try and cover most of the main elements that I presented in the last diagram. First is the history of international politics. Second, international law. Third, diplomacy. Fourth, international organizations. Fifth, international economy. Sixth, IR theory. And finally, globalization. And as I will be explaining at each turn, these 7 are placed in a logical order. So that concludes this introduction, and I hope you'll be joining me in the lectures to follow.